Well, welcome again to the Charles Redd Center lecture. Today is the December 2nd, 2021. My name is Jay Buckley. I'm the director of the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at BYU. Today's speaker is Eric Thacker. He grew up in the Uinta Basin in northeastern Utah, where he received his MS in range science and PhD in wildlife science at Utah State University. After completing graduate school, he moved to Oklahoma, where he worked as a rangeland scientist for 2 years at the USDA Southern Plains Range Research Station in Woodward, Oklahoma, and then for several years at Oklahoma State University. In 2013, he returned to Utah State University, and as the Rangeland Management Extension Specialist at Aggieland. So his research and extension programs included rangeland restoration, managing grazing during drought, wild horse impacts and management, cattle distribution, public land management, and sage-grouse studies. When he's not working, he enjoys chasing mule deer and upland birds with his bird dogs, fly fishing, and spending time with his lovely wife and 6 kids. Let's give a warm BYU welcome to our speaker, Eric Thacker.
So my wife made me promise that I wouldn't tell any BYU jokes, so I've taken those all out of my talk. It's good to be here today. Since it's a small group, I'm going to impose on you a little bit because I'd like to have more of a discussion than just me talking. So, how familiar is the group with wild horses? So? Do we have wild horses in Utah?
Yes.
Okay, yes, okay. So, this is an issue that I kind of got drug into. At the university, you have a lot of freedom. You still have a boss. And when the boss calls and says, hey, we don't have anybody working on this, why don't you jump in with both feet? Then you do. It's interesting, when I left Oklahoma to come back to Utah, this was one of the issues I hoped to avoid as a range extension specialist, but here I am. But what that means is that it's important to the people in Utah. And to give you a better my computer's froze up. Oh, God. Okay. To give you a better idea of what I do, because I'm a little bit different for a lot of reasons than most faculty at universities. So, Utah State University is a land grant institution, so each state has a land grant university. They were established in the late 1800s. Their goal was to provide teaching, extension, and research for the state. They're often the state schools. And then with the extension, the reason it came about, at that turn of the century, there was a lot of widespread poverty, especially in rural communities. And as they looked at how we're going to fix this, they decided that education was important. At the time, education was very limited, especially advanced education in those communities. So it started with President Lincoln actually signed the first act, and then extension was officially formed in 1914 with the Smith-Lever Act. And it was basically a program to deal with social poverty in poverty in rural communities. And the approach was we were going to take the education from the university and extend it to those communities. So the basis of extension is taking the research, the education opportunities at the university, and extending it to, originally was focused largely on rural communities, and this was both adult and child education. So I focus on adult education and extension. I have cohorts at the university that focus on 4-H. Who's heard of 4-H before? Okay, so 4-H is an extension of the land grant institution in your respective state. And so the approach was we're going to educate both the parents and the children to hopefully help them become better in agriculture and raise their level of well-being overall. So that was the original intent of extension. Obviously, in a state like Utah that is now more urban than it is rural, our roles have changed. But what it means is my official title is I'm the range extension specialist for Utah. So the good part of my job is nobody expects me to be in my office. So if I'm not in my office, nobody's worried because they assume I'm out doing good things. But the part of my job I really like is I spend a lot of time around the state, everywhere from San Juan County Box Elder County. So I've seen a lot of the state. I get to work with a lot of producers. And because we're a public land state, Utah's unique. We're the second in the nation in terms of the amount of land mass owned by the federal government. I also work a lot with the federal agencies, Bureau of Land Management, Forest Service, etc. in basically trying to extend science to those communities based around ranged lands and to improve rangeland management. The other thing that is important to recognize is each county has a county extension agent. Usually they have one that serves in a 4-H capacity and one that also serves in an ag or natural resource capacity here in Utah. So I also work directly with them. They are my linkage to the people in those communities. So literally there's a USU office in each of those communities, in each of those counties. So there's about 27 ag and natural resource county extension agents that I work with. The model is the specialists on campus work with the researchers on campus, and as needs arise, we take that information out to the community, and then we also bring back questions. So the reason I'm working on wild horses is because Tammy Pearson in Beaver County said, hey, we have a problem. Mark Wench in Beaver, he's on the border of Beaver and Millard County, said, oh, we have a problem. So here I am, today still talking about horses to address those needs. So a little bit about horses for those of you that aren't familiar. They're not as big as most domestic horses that you see in town. They're about 750 pounds. They're found in 10 western states. They eat about 8,000 pounds of grass and forage a year. For a grass nerd like me, that's significant. They breed at 12 to 15 months, and then they have about 11 months gestation. Similarly, burros, which I think are awful cool. They're much smaller, 10 western states. There's way fewer burros than there are horses, mostly because horses are way more popular than burros. They're interesting, they're very different. They breed at 18 months, a little bit longer gestation. So we're just going to jump into some facts. Wild horses and burros are not native to North America. Now, like all good scientists, I'm going to tell you it depends. So where did horses evolve? North America. So why am I saying horses are not native to North America?
Because Columbus brought them in 1493.
Yes. So they went extinct about 10 to 15,000 years ago. The last, as I'm aware of, and this is changing constantly, the last one they found is in the Yukon. It's called the Yukon horse. About around 10 to 13,000 years ago was the last known native horse to North America. So it's important to make that distinction, because what that tells us is the horses coming in have been heavily influenced through domestication, number one. And number two, they are not the same horse that was here before, and they don't occur with the same species, or the other suite of species that were here before. We're talking short-faced bear, right? The Ice Age bison, giant sloths, saber-toothed tigers, right? That's what was here when horses were here. It was much wetter, more grassland, so horses evolved into grassland. And we'll talk about where we kind of run into a problem trying to, quote unquote, use domestic horses to rewild North America. Wildland horses are descendants of Europeans horses. They have no natural predators. So it's important to remember, all the predators that would have preyed on horses in that late Ice Age are gone. So we're left, about the only thing that they've shown to be effective on killing horses currently are mountain lions. There's a whole discussion to be had there, because the ability of a mountain lion to kill a horse is very dependent upon the type of terrain that they're in, and so there's a limited number of areas that hold horses, that hold mountain lions, that we see this interaction. So my colleague David Stoner is researching a herd in Nevada where they are seeing some of this overlap. Basically the horses are up in the junipers and pinyons and up in the hills, where mountain lions, because they're not going to chase a horse down. They're not going to do, they have to, they're going to lay in wait for them and then jump on them. It looks like most of the predation is occurring on young foals. A mountain lion's not really interested in trying to drag down a 750-pound animal with really sharp hooves that can do damage. So there's a very limited opportunity for natural predation. So again, that's important to kind of keep in mind as we roll forward. This is the other interesting thing, is wild horse and burros are the only animal species that the BLM, Bureau of Land Management, I have to clarify that now because there's more BLM acronyms. It's the only animal species that's managed by the BLM. This is significant because the BLM was established as a land management agency. They were established to take care of the federal government's rangelands, somehow they got tagged with wild horses. I would love to have been in the room when that all went down, because I'm sure it didn't happen amenably. Then in 1971, wild horses were legally protected. So they have their, again, it's one of the few animal species that has their own legislation providing a level of protection to them. It could be argued that they have more legal protection than a lot of our endangered species that are listed on an ESA. For example, if you have a grizzly bear coming in and eating your sheep, you can file for a permit to take that animal, or you can take the animal and we'll sort it out after. However, if you have horses coming into your alfalfa, you're afforded no such latitude. So you're kind of stuck, which, well, you could have a whole discussion. The interesting terminology that I find in the Wild Horse and Burro Act is the BLM was tasked with managing horses in a thriving ecological balance with other uses. So the other uses are grazing, energy development, recreation, endangered species, open space, all of the things that happen on multiple use lands in the West that are managed by the BLM. I've always thought it would be fun to put a bunch of ecologists in the room and ask them to define what a thriving ecological balance is. I've went to plenty of school and I'm not sure I could define that well enough that it would certainly shape any sort of management structure moving forward. And so it's problematic in that this was what they've tasked with. They've kind of been given this nebulous thriving ecological balance. I promise you that that term is completely value laden with whatever you think is important in that thriving ecological system. So protected since 1971. And the reality is the protection came in response to mistreatment. Horses prior to 1971 were just considered, nobody owned them, they were just there. Some people gathered them up and sold them. Some people gathered them up and sold them for dog food. Some people just shot them. And so there was this real love-hate relationship with horses. Nobody owned them, nobody cared for them. So in response to that, a lady who was affectionately known as Wild Horse Annie started a letter writing campaign with elementary schools, and literally it passed with like 2 dissenting votes. So the 1971 Wild Horse and Burro Act legislatively was wildly successful in that it had a ton of support. I wonder now if they could see what's happened, whether there would still be the same support. Our own legislators voted in favor of that, even though it's causing some problems in the state today. The BLM has set appropriate management levels, so you'll hear me say AML a lot. What that means is, when the BLM was tasked with managing the horses, they looked at the land, they looked at the other uses, and they said, we've decided we can take, in the state of Utah, it's about 2,500 horses. Now, it's important to recognize that BLM's responsibility wasn't to grow horses, right? Their responsibility was to maintain or to preserve this legacy of the American West. So we have, since the protections were put in place, wild horse and burro numbers have continued to climb. The BLM decided that about 27,000 horses nationwide was the appropriate number. Don't ask for the science behind that. I've heard a lot of debate whether there was good science or whether there wasn't. Fact remains, nobody's really sure where that number came from, but it is the number that's in the BLM regulation, and so it's the number that we're held to currently. Even with the gathers that occurred this last summer because of the drought, we're still about 87,000 horses. So we're well over the 27,000, at least the way I do math. We're still over. If you do the math, wild horse populations reproduce at about 15 to 20% annually. So that means about every 4 years that number doubles. So as we're approaching that 100,000 horse mark, that means we're adding 15 to 20,000 horses annually to the population. So you can see the impeding problem. So here's horse populations from around the West. Nevada's lucky in terms of wild horses. Nevada also has 80% of the state of Nevada is federal land, so it's no surprise that Nevada ended up with most of the wild horses. So more than 60% of all the wild horses reside in Nevada. And so you can look at the graph, hopefully you can see that currently there's about 43,000 horses just in Nevada. So of the 71,000 horses, 43,000 of those horses occur in Nevada. Are there a lot of grasslands in Nevada? No. So let's be clear that Nevada is also the driest state in the union. I think there's also a correlation there as to why horses are there. I think it was often viewed that land wasn't worth much, and so we'll let the horses have it. That's just my theory. Anyway, you'll see Utah is 3,600. We were higher than that. We were closer to 4,800. They gathered about 2,000 horses this last summer due to the severe drought conditions, which we're still experiencing. So that brought us down to that 3,600. So you can see, even though Utah, we worry about this, we're about third or fourth in line in terms of horses. You've got Nevada, then Wyoming, California, and then Utah falls in line. Oh, and Oregon. So we're about fourth or fifth, depending on the counts for the given year. So specifically in Utah, we're currently at about 3,800 horses, about 400 burros. We're going to talk about the growth of the population. The other interesting part about a horse, they're a large animal, so once they reach adulthood, which is around 12 months, the likelihood of them surviving the 15 years is quite high. In fact, just to put a finer point on this, I'm not aware of any other wildlife species that has a reproductive rate of 15 to 20%. It's unheard of. So elk numbers, deer numbers, if we look at other large ungulates, right? Do elephants grow at 15 to 20% annually? No, dismally lower than that. So the point is, this is an anomaly in the realm of wildlife, if you want to term them as wildlife, or animals, wild feral animals on the landscape. They're growing at a rapid clip. So this does not, it actually kind of defies convention, because a large animal like a horse with a gestation period like a horse, you would expect to see growth rates like that. So why do you think the growth rates are so high for horses? I want you to think about it ecologically speaking. Why are growth rates so high?
You pointed out they don't have any natural predators, so there's nothing to keep that population.
Okay, so when you think about population, what controls, I'll use this in air quotes because it's a loose term, natural populations, right? So these are unmanaged populations. Although that's even hard to say. But what mechanisms do you have to control population? So we've already identified one, predation. What else?
The gender ratio?
Okay, what do you mean gender ratio?
Like a single stallion to a bunch of mares that can just reproduce with these large herds?
Okay, so interestingly enough, it doesn't take many stallions to cover a whole lot of mares. And again, this all comes back to a domestic animal that's been brought into a wild setting. So if you look at other species, bison, elk, other large animals that are using these landscapes, they have a breeding season, which means they breed in a very narrow window of time. In fact, you've got some great people here on campus, Brock McMillan, Randy Larson, that have done a lot of really good work looking at mule deer, for example, and their fawning dates and everything else. And so what you see is these very narrow breeding seasons. Do horses have breeding seasons? No. So do you see how this falls outside of convention? So they're not breeding during a particular season. Anytime across that 12 months, if a mare comes into heat, she'll get bred. So part of what that does is it makes it so a single stallion can cover a huge number of mares because it doesn't have to be covered in a very narrow window of time like it does with our other native ungulates. So again, just pointing out that these horses are falling outside of the conventional survival strategies or population dynamics that we see with a lot of other large ungulates. So the other one is disease. But again, we've got domesticated horses, so there are no native diseases to them here, although there are some diseases. And then the last is starvation. We'll talk about why starvation is not a great option for several reasons with wild horses. So this is the wild horse and burro management areas in Utah. They're called HMAs, horse management, or herd management areas, sorry. The reality is the I-15 corridor is the defining line. Most of the horses occur west of I-15. Again, what's one of the driest sides of the state? West of I-15. Are you seeing a correlation? So often these horses were left in the most unproductive, fragile landscapes that we had. So probably the forethought wasn't there in terms of what impact might they have long term. That cluster of horse management areas down here in the corner in that Beaver, Iron County, Millard County, that's really where most of the conflict with wild horses arises in the state. And it's interesting because there's about 7-ish counties that really have issues with wild horses. So even in a state like Utah, there's 29 counties, there's still only a few that are kind of bearing the brunt of this wild horse and burro program. So here's the numbers for Utah. What I find ironic is we've never been at AML, so we don't even know. So remember, that's the appropriate management level. We don't even know if that's a sustainable number because we've never been there. So numbers have risen. You can see numbers around 2000 really start jacking up. That's about 2004 is when they ended horse slaughter in the United States. Not that there was a large number of wild horses going to slaughter, but that also stopped the slaughter of domestic horses, which really doesn't sound like a big deal, but it became a big deal because there's been documented cases of horses being turned loose. So you buy a horse, you decide, hey, got really expensive, you've lost your job, you can't pay for the horse, so you drive it to the desert and you turn it loose to run with Spirit and the rest of the horses in the West Desert. So is there a problem with that?
Yes.
Why? Well, there's lots of problems with it, but
Lots and lots of problems.
But legally, how do you separate horses at that point? How do you know that horse is wild or domesticated?
Brand.
Right, if there's a brand, but a lot of horses are not branded. A lot of people don't brand or mark horses for a lot of various reasons. So the point is we added horses to that population, which that's been going on for a very long time. That's largely why we have wild horses. Ranches, etc., would turn horses loose in the fall and they'd gather them in the spring when they needed them. So we've augmented our horse herds. Like in the 2009, during that recession, there was a significant bump in horse numbers that largely people were theorizing was due to people turning horses out. You can see the gathers that occurred in 2020. You see that big drop in population. That was solely because of the gathers. There's about 2,000 horses that were gathered. And that was a fortunate situation. The BLM had gotten a shot in the arm in funding. They got an extra $21 million the year before. Due to the drought, they were able to justify those gathers, and so they gathered a bunch of horses. However, I want to point out that a single year of reproduction will make up that difference. So I want you to think about that for a minute. It costs about $1,100 per horse to gather a horse. By the time you pay for the people to go out, contractors to ride them in, bring them in, make sure they're healthy, put them in a holding pen, it's $1,100. So, once you start thinking about costs, if we're gathering 2,000 horses annually, just in Utah, remember, we're not talking about the 42,000 horses in Nevada and the costs associated with that. So these are apparent population growth rates, so especially don't tell Dr. Larson that I had population growth rates on a graph. This is just, I took 15% because that's more conservative. Just assuming we do nothing with wild horses in Utah, by 2033 we're up around 35,000 horses. Now I want you to just stop for a minute and try to imagine in your mind what 35,000 horses looks like. So it's a lot of animals. You're now approaching close to where we are with elk in the state, just for a point of reference. We already have more horses than we have bison in the western U.S., just for, again. So the current management approach to the BLM. Now, in my opinion, nobody should ever throw rocks at the BLM over the wild horse issue. Maybe never is too strong. If the BLM was allowed to manage horses as the Wild Horse and Burro Act was originally written, it allowed them to have many tools to deal with this overpopulation issue. However, because of individuals advocating for the horse, there's been additional legislation passed that has put roadblocks in front of many of the tools that the BLM has to manage wild horses. So currently, really the only tools the BLM has to manage horses is they gather them. So this is pretty typical. You can see the helicopter pushing them into a trap, push them into a corral, they load them onto trailers. We have one holding facility here in Utah, well actually two. One is Axtell, which is a privately owned holding facility, and then the Delta facility. They'll trailer them to that Delta facility, bring them in, make sure they're healthy. Once they've brought them in, then they will send them out for adoption. Has anybody adopted a wild horse? Awesome. So, anybody know how many horses we're adopting annually? Yes.
Small.
A little higher. So, we have been averaging around 3 to 5. Just probably hay prices had a lot to do with that. I don't know for sure. This last year, the BLM had instituted a program where they would pay you $1,000 to take the horse. Now that sounds like a lot of money, and we'll talk about why it actually was a really good deal. So they bumped clear up to 8,000 horses. So while that sounds like a lot, 8,000 horses is a drop in the bucket compared to the full crop that'll be hitting the ground over the course of the next several months. So you could adopt every horse that they have, well, I shouldn't say it quite, well, yeah, you could. You could adopt every horse they have in the program, and you still wouldn't begin to cut into that overall population growth. It would still continue to grow. So while adoption's important, I just want to make the point that it is not currently a tenable solution. Now, interesting side note, if we're at 27,000 horses, then the 3,000 horses we're adopting annually is keeping up with the current reproduction rates. Meaning, you could maintain a horse herd if you're adopting 3,000 to 4,000 horses a year if we're at 27,000 horses, but at 80,000 horses, we're not even close. So the other option is usually they call it the 3-strike rule. After the horses have been out for 3 different adoption events and nobody takes them home, then they go to a long-term holding facility. So I was in Oklahoma. This is actually close to one of the ranches that the church owns. I was driving across this beautiful prairie in May, and all of a sudden I saw all these horses, and I knew they were wild horses because of the way they looked. So I stopped and took a photo, asked around, and there's a 45,000 acre ranch in north central Oklahoma that all they run now is wild horses on a government contract. So these are horses that have been pulled off the deserts in Nevada, Wyoming, Utah, Oregon, and they've shipped them to Oklahoma, and they're now living out their life in a long-term holding facility. Anybody have an idea what it costs when we send a horse to long-term holding? Give me a guess.
Hyper expensive.
Millions.
So it's $50,000 a head. So when you
Grazing, do they feed them in the winter?
They do. So for the most part, they just leave them be. Like this particular operation, they're just out on the prairie. They supplemented them with a little bit of protein in the wintertime, and they brought them in once a year and gave them a vaccine. They separate the horses by sex, so there's no reproduction occurring in these holding facilities. So they're not reproductive. But again, remember they live for about 15 years. So in general, for each of those horses that isn't adopted, the U.S. government basically writes about a $45,000 to $50,000 check to maintain that horse until it dies in holding. So
50,000 per year?
per horse, sorry, no, just
Per horse over the life of the horse?
over the life of the horse. So this contract, and this has been 10 years ago. The contract in Oklahoma was around $1 a head per day. So for each horse they had on the place, they got $1 per day, which doesn't sound like much, but if you start doing math on 45,000 acres, they were clearing about $1 million annually with this. So they're making way more money than they probably would with cattle. The current contracts I've seen are as high as $10 to $20 a head per day now. Because some of these are no longer in pastures, they're actually feeding them hay, which anybody that's bought hay knows how expensive hay's been the last year or two because of the drought. So the point is this cost is increasing. There's a slide I did not include. Dr. Garrett, who was a researcher at Montana State, modeled population growth, and then he also looked at the economics, and he estimated that by 2035 we would be spending in excess of $100 million annually just to maintain these horses in holding if we kind of maintain this current management approach of gather, adopt, and hold. So what's the downside if we don't do the gather, adopt, and hold? What happens? Then we just have horses gathering up on the range, right? So there's 55,000 horses currently in holding. So this is horses that have been taken off the range, and we are paying, as a taxpayer, you're paying to have those horses fed and taken care of in a private setting. A lot of those are occurring in the Midwest. There are some here in the West, but most of them are occurring in the Midwest. Then over here on the far right is the budget expenditures. So the problem is where's the bulk of the money being spent within that Wild Horse and Burro program? So they started with $115 million. What's costing them the most money? Holding. Do you see a problem? So they're spending over 60% of their budget on something that isn't actually addressing the problem on the range with the number of horses. So you can see this isn't a simple problem, and I'm just scratching the surface in terms of the complexities of all the moving parts here. You can see they spend about $14 million on adoptions. Gathers and removals is about $4 to $5 million, and other activities that usually includes salaries, etc., stuff like that. This budget's inflated because they've got about a $20 million bump. Senator Lee had asked for a hearing on wild horses, so I'm sure he had heard from some of his constituents. It appeared to me he was very concerned about the price tag of the program, but recognizing the price tag of the program could get worse than it is if something wasn't done. So they allocated an additional $21 million in 2019, which by estimates is about a quarter of what they need annually to deal with the problem to take care of it over the long term. Okay, so here's the interesting part, is all of this stuff with wild horses, all the legislation that's been passed, there had not been a nationwide survey done. So I'm not a social scientist, I work with social scientists, but I was shocked that there'd never been a thorough, representative survey done. So one of my colleagues, Nikki Frey, who also works in Extension, she's actually centered out of Cedar City, conducted a survey. And so she did the usual thing, tried to get a broad cross-section of the country by region, by age, by income. So we got a representative sample. Some of the purported surveys that have been done before, it was unclear as to how they'd drawn their sample, which anybody that knows anything about surveys, that can make a huge difference in the outcome of the survey. So this was kind of the first independent. Obviously certain groups had done their own surveys, which, anyway. So just the usual. So she asked a bunch of really interesting questions. So she says, please select the most accurate statement about wild horses in America. I don't know. Horses were introduced. Horses were introduced by European explorers. They crossed the Bering Sea land bridge, and horses are native to North America. So it's interesting, most people got it right, but if you look at the other two, the I don't know is pretty high, but then horses are native to North America is not far behind. So again, there's just a lot of people that are just not familiar with wild horses, which is really not that surprising. Where do most people get their information about wild horses?
Popular culture, romantic movies.
So name them. What movies come off the top of your head? Spirit. I threw it out of my house. Sorry. Right? So we have movies like Spirit. There's a whole TV series now about Spirit. So a lot of people don't have any sort of formal exposure to actual data on wild horses. And that's what really comes out in this survey. Again, you look at the I don't know bar here. The Wild Free Roaming Act of 1971 recommends that there are no more than 27,000. And then it says, today there are about how many horses? So most people don't know. Most people, remember, we're up here, right, in terms of how many horses. We're at 87,000. So again, a lot of people have no concept as to how expansive this problem's become. In fact, one of the students in one of my classes, she's from Pennsylvania, she shared this with the class. I'm comfortable sharing it with you all. She grew up as what she termed a typical horse girl in Pennsylvania. She rode dressage. She loved her horse, right? So when she started looking at school, she chose to come west because she wanted to come out and fight the good fight and save the American Mustang. Because everything she had heard leading up to this point in her cultural circles was about the fact that these horses were going to blink out, that we were losing them, that they were no longer going to be on the landscapes in the West. So she came, she's in our college, the College of Natural Resources, so there was this rude awakening when she recognized that most of the information that she'd been fed was not accurate in terms of even just the number of horses and the reproductive rates of said horses. And so again, you look at that I don't know graph, it's pretty telling. Do they compete with native wildlife? Again, Dr. Larson has a really good paper. Steve Peterson, these are all people that are here at BYU, have done some really good work that I use often in these situations to show the competition. What I found interesting is most people agreed, well, you've got some that are in the middle, which means they don't know, right? So are free roaming horses competing with native wildlife for limited water and food? Yes, they have to. What sets up a situation where you're competing? There's not enough to go around, right? I grew up with 4 brothers, so there was competition at the dinner table because there was never enough to go around. So the problem is when people look at the West, do they think of limited resources? Could you imagine not having enough grass on 300,000 acres to support 1,000 horses? Can you even?
I can imagine it.
You can imagine, and you should, because especially the last year, there wasn't enough grass in many situations and horses were really thin. So the point is, I just think people have a hard time imagining the scale at which this is all occurring, especially if you're from somewhere east of Denver. You can't imagine that 300,000 acres would not produce enough grass to feed a few hundred horses. It's mind-boggling. Do they compete with domestic animals, cattle and livestock? So we see less support for that. However, they're all on the landscape eating the same things. One of the first radio interviews I did on wild horses was this exact issue. The reality is in most years when we have normal or above normal precipitation, we don't hear as much about horses. Why? Because there's not as much scarcity, right? But once producers start running out of feed for cattle and elk and deer populations are struggling, and because they can't, they're not reproducing because they don't have enough food to keep themselves in a good physiological condition, then that's when this really starts to hit the skid. So 2021 was a doozy. So which of the following states have horses? It's quite interesting. Most people didn't know that their own state had horses. So here, people suppose Montana has a lot of wild horses. Montana has a single herd management area with about 200 horses on it. Whereas a place like Nevada, right? So only about 25% of the people thought Nevada had horses. Remember how many Nevada had? 42,000. So you're seeing the common trend here. There's a lot of people that are just not informed around the situation with wild horses. So again, they asked them what kind of lands they're living on. Grasslands was the right answer. Well, that's what most people thought. The reality is in Nevada and Utah, there aren't a lot of grasslands because we're too dry. You have to have usually in excess of 13 inches to have a grassland. There's a huge chunk of Utah that does not receive 13 inches. Is the government authorized? What tools? This was really interesting, so they asked them what the government can do. Again, that I don't know is the winning. Adoption, removal from public lands, sterilization, castration, euthanasia. So you can see that those two are the least popular. The survey, we assumed it would be way worse than that. So we were surprised that there was even that much support for those two very dramatic management options. I will tell you right now that euthanasia will never happen. Not in my lifetime. There is no way. There's so much public resistance to euthanizing a horse because there's not enough land to support it that it just won't happen. So this is one of my favorites. Allow nature to take its course without human intervention. So is there a problem with that, the basis there?
Well, we do nothing but intervene.
So has there been a landscape without humans intervening? You can answer that question very well for us. Not often. And so especially with horses, well, more recently horses in the U.S., so we've kind of taken Native Americans out of that equation. So prior to, the Europeans brought the horses, the Native Americans very quickly became very adept at using the horses. There's some tribes with incredibly strong horse culture. In a very short period of time, they acclimated and became very efficient with it. But again, this type of question always grates a little bit because it's making the assumption that nobody was ever taking care or managing horses. But asking people what they think, again, we see people that didn't want to answer the question and said neither. Then you've got somewhat agree and somewhat or strongly agree. So what is the problem with allowing horses to let nature run its course with horses?
They're just going to starve.
What do you mean they're going to starve?
Well, there's not.
That's a pretty pessimistic approach. What do you mean they're going to starve? No, you're right. I'm just giving you a hard time. Why are they going to starve?
Well, look at the lands that they're on. There's nothing for anybody to eat.
Right. So there's little forage to begin with, right? So I think this has been romanticized in, we'll call it pop ecology, that if we would just back out as humans and leave it alone, then nature will just magically balance itself out. Number one, that approach largely overlooks the fact that Native Americans here in North America have been at play in these ecological systems for a very long time. I think it's somewhat disrespectful to discount the role that they played in manipulating these landscapes to get what they needed from those landscapes, i.e. they burned, they hunted, they killed animals, horses, they were catching them and trading them, right? So they ate them. So there's certainly a level of human interaction. This to me is a catastrophic approach, is to let nature take its course. Secondarily, did we identify any population control mechanisms for wild horses? No, so they are going to starve, right? The only population control mechanism left is the horses will eat themselves out of house and home, and then they will all stand around and starve to death, which doesn't sound appealing. Now the problem is, when you look at the West, is it hard to convince people that the animal could starve to death with how many millions of acres that the BLM is managing? They can't, it's hard for people to conceptualize the fact that there is a limited amount of resources in the West, specifically with forage. So, here's one of the things that I find really interesting kind of from a social-political standpoint with the wild horse and burro situation. So this map just shows population density. So do you know any correlations between where wild horses exist and human populations? What's the correlation? Lots of horses and fewer people, right? So again, remember, these are the states right here with most of the wild horse and burros. So what's interesting when you think about it, this is a national level policy, right? So this was passed at the federal level, and it largely focuses on those 10 western states, which the population of those 10 western states probably doesn't even equal one of the eastern seaboard states. So do you see where this gets interesting?
They're also red states.
Yes, often. Although it's interesting to point out the wild horse and burro program is one thing that doesn't fall with political lines. Senator Stewart, or Representative Stewart from here in Utah, proposed some legislation. The competing legislation that beat him out was written by a Republican from New York. So it's not simple at all. But basically what you have happening, and for some of you that grew up in the West, this is the chip we carry, right? On our shoulders, especially if you're from rural communities, is that you've got people that live thousands of miles away that are now dictating. Not saying this is the way we should think, this is the way it's often perceived, is that you've got the edges of the country on the seaboards making decisions that impact us locally. And so with the wild horse and burro program, what you have is you have a national level policy that's been passed and implemented, and the people bearing the brunt or the cost of that legislation is relatively small. In fact, if you look at Utah's situation, you can boil down if we looked at livestock producers, for example, that are negatively impacted financially by wild horse and burros, you can boil that down to less than 10 producers in the state. So what that means is there's 10 producers bearing the cost of that program in the state of Utah. So what's the problem with that? Is there a problem? Is that equitable? So the problem is there's not a lot of representation for those that are bearing the blunt of that federal policy. I'm not trying to make this political at all. I'm just saying that's the reality of this program.
It is political.
But it makes it very difficult to see any changes occur because the people feeling the effects of these programs, rural counties like Beaver County, don't have enough voting base to where they really have a seat at the table. Does that make sense? So not necessarily trying to make it political, but the social political structure certainly has influenced the way this program works. So I often get asked, what have we done? What are we doing? When I was first asked to work on the problem, the thing that became painfully apparent, like all good researchers, I dove into the scientific literature, and after a week I picked my head up and said, man, all the literature here is here to justify all of the management action that's needed. So this isn't a problem, which is rare, where we look at a situation and say, we already know the answer. The answer is we've got to figure out how to get fewer horses on the landscape. There's just too many animals on the landscape. And so how do we do that? So to me, and especially since I work in extension, I'm like, aha, this is an educational campaign, right? We need to educate people. So how do you educate people about wild horses? If you have answers to this, you may have a job. So legitimately it becomes difficult, right? Because you have to figure out how you're going to reach people in, say, for example, Salt Lake County, right? Provo, Utah. Because I guarantee if you went, or in your class, just ask the person next to you if they know about wild horses. Ask them what they know. Are they in the state? I think you'll be shocked, even in a state like Utah, even though one of the most photographed herds is about, probably not even 30 miles as the crow flies from where we're standing, the Anarchy herd out by Simpson Springs. So if you all want to go see a horse, drive out to Simpson Springs. It's not that far from here. What, 40 minutes? If that is not far. One of the most photographed herds, the horses are pretty approachable. That doesn't mean you should get out of your car and approach them, but you can see them from your car routinely. However, we've got to figure out how to reach these people. So the first approach was a conglomerate of people, mostly from Utah and Nevada. We put together a Wild Horse and Burro Summit. Our hope was to, I'm in extension, right? Bring people into a room, tell them what all the good science is so they can go home and tell. So we tried to invite groups that we thought would matter. Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, right? Audubon Society. These are people that have members that belong to their group, with the theory is they'd kind of disseminate this information to their group. I was incredibly naive. In fact, interesting side note, Gus War, who is the BLM Wild Horse and Burro Coordinator for Utah, before we started this meeting, he said, are you ready? And I said, ready for what? And he said, well, it's coming. And I said, oh, Gus, I've dealt with controversial subjects before. I'll be okay. 2 days later, I called him and said I had no idea what was coming. So within less than an hour of the doors opening in Salt Lake City for this meeting, there was a billboard on I-15 on the exit to go to the hotel we were at, where we were holding the meeting, that hashtag Slaughter Summit. It trended on Twitter. If you get bored this weekend, just type Slaughter Summit in on Twitter, and you'll have a couple hours worth of reading. They protested out front of the hotel. 90% of the news articles that were written were very negative. We got our butt handed to us, literally. I mean, we were successful and we gave a bunch of good information, but it was clear to us as we walked away that we weren't successful in reaching a broad audience, because most of the publicity generated around this event was all very negative. And so it was not our intent. We didn't get our good scientific-based information out. That's probably the better way to say it. So in 2019, after we'd licked our wounds, we put another meeting together. We tried to invite an even broader cross-section. We actually invited the advocates to this meeting, which took some real convincing to convince some people that had had a lot of struggle with wild horse advocates in the past. But we invited them in, we laid ground rules down, and we had a 2-day conference with Cloud Foundation, American Wild Horse Campaign, kind of the big players, cattlemen's groups there, county commissioners there, all in the same room. The goal of the meeting was to try to find some common ground. Is there a silver thread that weaves through all of these different groups that we could identify, that we could then kind of, could we agree that we needed to somehow figure out how to manage wild horse numbers? You know, that was kind of our, can we just agree with that? There's been some agreement around that. There's some groups, if you think about wild horse, people that are concerned about wild horses in a population, just on a bell-shaped curve, right? There's about 90% that are approachable. And then you've got those in the tails that either want them all dead or they don't want you to touch them. So in my career in extension, I've just decided you just lop those ends off and forget they exist, because they're not amenable. You're not going to change their minds with good information. You're not going to reach them with good information. So you proceed with that main group in the middle, which is what we've tried to do. 2019 is when Senator Lee called for a wild horse hearing. This was significant. It was the first time the Senate had talked about wild horses in almost 20 years. So this was one of Senator DeLee's questions to me is, how much has our wild horse population grown in the 20 years that we have not even addressed this issue? We've just been writing checks without asking questions about it. We also hosted a workshop in DC to try to educate staffers. I say we, there's a large group of us through it's called the Freeze Network, that we're trying to educate staffers of representatives and congressmen in Washington, D.C., so hopefully they would have a little more objective information moving forward. That was met with mixed success. COVID has really put a pinch in a lot of stuff. We were able to hold a meeting in Cody. Again, we invited the whole group. We had people kind of from the whole cross section. So we're trying, but it's a slow uphill battle. And I'm not. Jay had asked me if I was going to give you the answers to the wild horse problem. I don't know that I can do that. I think collectively, until there's a large enough group of people that recognize the problem and they recognize that it needs to be addressed, will be addressed. So often I get asked the questions, why are horses such a big deal? I grew up with horses. This is why I thought I was qualified to work on wild horses, is I really like horses. I've owned horses. I'd hoped my career would involve a horse most of my life. I just didn't imagine it would look like this. However, I found this recent article. It's published in Nature. But the statement at the bottom, this to me sums it all up. So there's two animals that co-evolved with humans that made our life better. What are they?
Horses.
Dogs and horses, which I like dogs as well. So, but the researcher, one of the statements he makes, he says, the history of human is wrapped in horse DNA. Kane says the relationship between people and their horses is really interesting to me. It tells the story of both of our species and DNA. So, not only do we just think horses are neat, I think there's almost a subconscious biological tie, because this is a species that we co-evolved with in many parts of the world that actually improved our quality of life. And so I think we are inexplicably tied to horses. I know that sounds awful squishy, especially for a scientist to be telling you, but it's the only explanation I have as to why this is such a big deal, especially in North America. We are incredibly tightly tied emotionally, almost physically, to horses. Especially in our country, we look at them and they were part of what helped with the westward expansion, and they were part of the labor force that helped us do the many great things that we've done, and so we're tied with them. Now this is my one claim to fame, so I have a meme. So when Senator Lee called his hearing, I was asked to come and testify at the Senate hearing. And within a few hours of me walking out the door, this is what I found. So, but again, I put this up mostly because I think it's really funny. Second, it also tells you how incredibly intense this is. So there's people that are aware this is going on. They're waiting for the moment that we walk out of the room to try to set a narrative about what happened in that Senate hearing. So Ethan Lane was, at the time, the representative of the Cattlemen's Association. He testified. Pendley was the director of the BLM. He wasn't even in the room when we testified, but I found it ironically he still made it. Senator Lee had called for the meeting, so there he is. And then this particular group had, I've got some other tweets that I won't show you, but anyway. So I told my kids I've reached cool status because I have my own means. So in conclusion, as you think about this going forward, especially of those of you that are going to work in natural resources, as always, we must be objective with our information. The wild horse and burro thing is incredibly emotionally charged, which means there's a lot of biased information that floats, a lot of propaganda. On both sides, we have to avoid emotion, sensationalism, fear, and fear-mongering. And then secondarily, I'm completely convinced if we allow the land management agencies to do their jobs, these are trained professionals. They've been trained at your institution, at my institution, right? These are our people. If we would allow them to do their jobs, this could happen. Then last, I point out the horses are not magic or evil. So I don't want to leave the impression that if we just simply figured out how to get rid of 60,000 horses, all of the West's land management issues would go away, because there is a load of issues. This is just one of them. Secondarily, horses aren't magic, meaning they can't grow forever, their populations can't grow forever without any sort of negative repercussions. There are limits to our resources. They're exhaustible. They're not infinite. And horses are just a herbivore, period. Meaning they have to have food to eat, they have to have water to drink, and there's limits on how far they can be pushed. And then time is of the essence. I don't know why I still have that in there. You saw the population growth curves. I've probably made it look worse than it is, but the problem is they're growing at a rapid pace. What worries me is we often politically want to take a let's wait and see approach. Well, in 10, 15 years, we can add a significant number of horses, which then only compounds the cost, both to the horses and to the ecological systems and to us as taxpayers to fix that problem. And with that, if I have time, we'll take some questions.
If you'll repeat the questions, that will help as well.
Okay.
I'll start out with one. Can individual states propose a management plan to the BLM, or does it have to be more united in approach?
So that's a great question. In fact, so the question was, can states propose their own management approach? There's a lot of benefits to being in Utah, and one of them is that surprisingly we have some fairly proactive approaches. So the state of Utah has allotted some funds that they then use to kind of help, basically told the BLM, hey, we've got some funds, we're willing to help you gather horses in some areas that we're really worried about horses. So that's one way that they've done that. Technically, no, because this is a federal issue. It has to be done with, so the BLM was basically the state of Utah was providing support for current BLM management plans that they may not have had money to implement. That's the way to kind of think about that. I thought it was a proactive approach by the legislature to have the forethought to do that, because it actually gave us, I say us, meaning the state, kind of a seat at the table to have a conversation about where horses needed to be gathered. But it all must be done within the existing framework of BLM management. Because they're federally protected, because the BLM is tasked with managing them, all that management has to happen within the BLM channels proposed. It has to go through NEPA, all the regular checks and balances. So in the act, it actually stipulates that the BLM should coordinate with the state game management agencies to set numbers. But that's not gone well. There's probably a variety of reasons. So there are some opportunities for the state to have a say, but ultimately it comes down to the BLM is the ones tasked with managing. There's a question right here.
So if you showed us all this stuff of people being misinformed and just not knowing about it at all, why don't we educate in elementary schools and from?
So the question was, if I've shown, so he's calling me out. I've shown a lot of information on the graph showing that people are not informed. So why don't we do some educational programs? So we have started, in fact last year was the first year we started what we called the Mustang Camp, Boot Camp, where we were specifically trying to target urban young people from like 12 to 17, kind of in that range. We take them out on a 2-day, this is a 4-H program, we take them out, show them wild horses, we show them some range management stuff about how you assess how much grass is available, and to help them understand that there's limits. So we're trying. The problem is, like a lot of things, there's not a ton of funding or support for those educational programs, which is unfortunate. Because you're right, you're completely right, that kind of the way we got into this program is we made a bunch of kids aware of the fact that there was a problem, right? And I'm convinced that part of the way we'll get out of this is making a bunch of kids aware that there's a problem that needs to be fixed. My concern is that a lot of the native wildlife we value is what we stand to lose if we don't correct this problem. So, really good question. Thank you.
You think if we could get to that 27,000 number, that from there it could be sustainable and we could gather enough every year to make it work?
Yeah, I do. Most of the logistics that people have looked at, so yes, the short answer is yes, I do. So I already talked about adoptions, right? Because at 27,000, the current adoption rate would keep up with, like 80–90% of the full crop annually, meaning we're not putting a bunch of horses in a pasture in Oklahoma to live out the rest of their life, right? Secondarily, the other component to this is just gathering horses by itself is not an answer to the problem. Because we would constantly be gathering horses, and then what do we do with them once we gather them, right? So the reality is, moving forward, it has to be a multi-pronged approach where we look at sterilization, where we also look at contraceptives. There's been quite a bit of research done identifying contraceptives to reduce the reproductive rates of those herds. So I think the reality is, the path forward is there has to be kind of this multifaceted approach that would include gathers, contraception, and all that. But all of that is only feasible when we're down around that 30,000 horse mark. If you just start doing math, right, at 80,000, 90, well, we'll just call it an even 100,000 horses, because by June we'll probably be close to 100,000 horses in Utah. So just since that's a round number, you assume that about 60% of those are mares. So that means we have about 60,000 mares. The current contraception that is most accepted in terms of its use requires a shot every year or every other year. So I want you to think about gathering 60,000 horses across hundreds of thousands of acres every other year to administer a shot. The logistics of that, I don't think it's feasible, right? I don't know how many people would you have to administer that shot, whether you're shooting them, whether you're bringing them into a corral, water trapping them, food trapping them, etc. So I think the only way the only way I see a way out of this situation is we have to bring that down to a manageable number, somewhere around that 30,000 mark, which is where we can sustain those populations more sustainably. Did that answer your question?
Yeah. And do you think that to get to that, like, such a huge drop, it would basically need culling? Like, there wouldn't be another way to do it?
So his question was, to get to that 30,000 horse mark, what would we need? Would we need culling? Well, we could have talked for hours today, just in the stuff that I've learned over the last several years. That first Wild Horse and Burro Summit that we had, the thing that I walked away with is we will not kill horses. It's not palatable to the American people as a whole. So that is not going to happen. So it changed my whole frame of mind in thinking about this problem. As I know it makes biological sense. I know it makes logic. There's a lot of things it does. But I have to go back to that emotional connection is real to the horses, and people just will not tolerate that currently. Now, things may change in the future. So I think one of the only ways we do it is we increase gathers. And for a period of time, we're just going to have to put those horses into holding until they die. So you're talking a 15-year program, right? 15-year plus program where you're gathering as many horses as you can annually, putting them into holding to drive that overall herd size down. And at the same time, you're administering contraception, you're sterilizing mostly studs. There's not a good way to sterilize mares right now. So does that make sense? You're kind of working from the bottom to the top. You're slowing that population curve, and then you're cutting into that main herd. There was a proposal put forward. It was called the Path Forward, and that's basically what it proposed. It proposed in the very aggressive gathers and use of contraceptives. They figured in about 10 to 15 years they could get that overall population down around that 30,000 mark, and then at that point the program would be much easier to sustain over the long term. So I think it's critical. I think that's the only way out. Otherwise, I think at some level we're going to see some sort of catastrophic failure, meaning we're going to have lands go broke and horses die of not having enough to eat. That sounds really pessimistic, but it's somewhat inevitable.
But the only way to do it is to cull them. You know that. I mean, I saw your thing, let's eat them. The French eat them.
Yeah.
I mean, it's... I mean, we've got to find a way. I mean, science, America has proved that they don't believe in science, for one thing, right? but I mean, I just don't know. I had a conversation with a group of guys that I ride with. We were riding up Monday. We were talking. I tried to get them to come with me here. They're pragmatic ranchers. You know, they love their livestock, they love their horses, but when they have to put their horse down, they put it down. And I've had, you know, and even domestic horses, you can't process it. And these people just, they can't imagine how wasteful, they just can't, you know, ranchers, they cannot abide waste.
Well, I have a great story. Maybe we're running out of time for stories, but we had some visiting folks from Kyrgyzstan. So that's in Central Asia, really strong horse culture. Now that they're no longer part of the USSR, they're trying to figure out how do we manage grazing on these public lands. So a former professor brought a group here, and so we were driving around showing them how BLM works. And so we're driving across the West Desert in Box Elder County. There's one woman in the car that speaks some English. Other than that, the rest of the van's full of people that don't understand me and I don't understand them. They ask a question, do you have horses on your rangelands? And I thought, oh man, how do I explain our wild horse situation to these, again, this incredibly strong horse culture for thousands of years, right? But they also eat horses, they drink the mare's milk, like there's this whole culture wrapped up in it. And so I'm driving and I'm like, so how do I explain this without taking hours to tell them why we're where we're at? And so the only thing I could come up with is, well, we do have horses, yes. And then they said, well, what do you do with them? Which is the question I was afraid was coming. So how would you answer that? What do we do with our horses? So I finally just said, we just let them live. She looked at me, she said, what do you mean? I said, well, just like pets, which I just wanted to crawl onto the floorboard of the van because it sounds so ridiculous, right? But how else do you explain that? And so I told her, and you could see her trying to process, and then she turned around and told the rest of the band what I'd said, and for like 15 minutes, all this talking going on, and I couldn't decide whether it would have been good if I could have understood it or not.
Crazy America.
But from their perspective, they could not fathom. In fact, they finally said, hey, how many do you have extra? We'll take them, ship them, right? Because to them, this is an incredible resource. And so on a philosophical level, it's very perplexing as to how we've gotten to where we're at. Even the way Native Americans used horses, which these are their horses, the way I see it, right? And yet they ate them. They used them for every part of their life. And so, while that all makes sense right now, I completely, even when I present to ecologists, the most common response I have is, well, I don't do with wild horses, we'll just shoot them. And this is ecologists, right? They're seeing it very clinically. The reality is, currently, the U.S. citizens will not stand for it. Just won't do it. So unless something changes culturally,
well, I'm not
to make
talking
that
about
acceptable.
machine gunning them.
No.
I'm talking about processing them and let slaughterhouses. I mean, it's just such a waste. We have a resource that we could use economically. We could leverage it.
We're importing, for example, we're importing horse meat from other countries to feed the zoo animals.
Well, just from like a 1 minute glance at that Summit Slaughter hashtag, it sounds like that's kind of what you would suggest.
Well,
that people
actually I didn't. So this is a good lesson in never using.
Slaughter, what does slaughter mean?
Well, it's a very negative.
Yeah, well, you can process them and use them. It's insane.
Well, and what happened there is at the Society for Range Management meetings 2 years before, they actually had a guy come in from Mexico that ran a slaughter plant. Mm-hmm. And so the reason they had him come in is, how are horses used? How does this work? What does it look like? So he normally slaughters beef and goats and sheep. And then I remember 1 day a week or twice a month or whatever, he had a schedule. He would just process horses. And he talked about that in Mexico, that was the protein source for most low-income people in Mexico. So it was an important part of their foodscape, so to speak. So he had a slide that said, would the American people support using wild horses for a protein source? I don't have an exact quote. So I took a picture of that and I tweeted it, and I just reiterated the question, would people support use of wild horses as a protein source? However, in social media, they don't have to use what you intended to be used. So it turned into Eat the Horses Thacker, right? That's me. Because it got twisted into this whole thing that I proposed that we're going to kill and eat all the horses. Which,
I mean, I'm not really against that. It seems like the horse people aren't the people that have the biggest problem with the
it's
slaughter.
complicated. I promise you it's complicated.
No, I'm sure.
Because when I usually give a talk, because I watch people come in, you're kind of like boots, buckles, Birkenstocks, right? You're kind of like sorting out where your problems are coming from. But when I started with horses, I could no longer do that. Because I had people come in with boots and sit on this side, and people come in with boots and sit on this side. So you're like, so if anything's going to get thrown at me, where it's coming from, and then I realized it was the whole place. So it's not as clean as we'd like to think. It really isn't.
So my question, you talked, I think a couple slides ago about the environmental impact they have. Is they're just kind of left to sit on this, I don't know, kind of, it's not even grassland, it's kind of desert, like on the
It's
map.
a shrub semi-desert.
Yeah, so you talked about how it's gonna, let's just say magically somehow, you get down to that magic number where you can manage it. Is it, because you're already looking at a pretty arid environment, how long or is it possible to get that back to where it can? I guess that's my question, like, because if you just leave them there, they don't rotate out, it's not like, so I'm just curious how that has an impact on where they're sitting.
So the question is, what do we do about horses, even if we get them to 30,000, because you've still got them using the landscape, right? And will it magically all go back to the way it was before? Is that the question?
Yeah, that's, yeah.
Good enough?
Yeah.
It won't. So here's the other complicating factor on all of this. And again, I took the slide out because I didn't think I'd have time. Climate change is now changing what we thought was the norm. So even without horses, because of climate change, we're not going back to what was there in 1971 when they established. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. There has been irreparable damage done. We've converted a lot of that shrub steppe or shrub semi-desert to annual grasses. It's not coming back. Does that make sense? And so now that you place climate change coming in the future, you have more than likely what a lot of the projections are kind of predicting is we're going to have a reduced capacity to produce forage with increasing horse numbers, right? Nobody sees there's a problem with that, right? Those two things will have, you see what I'm saying? And so the whole other part of this conversation that's even more difficult is we might get to 30,000 and decide, hey folks, it needs to be lower, right? So it's a very insightful question you ask, because right now I think we're so worried about just what's in front of us, but the reality is at some point we've got to pick our head up and think, how are we going to deal with this into the future? Because we are not going to restore a lot of those lands. They're degraded beyond. And that's not all because of horses, right? We have examples of past grazing from livestock and everything else that's helped contribute to that. So again, I don't want to pin this all on the horses, but the horses are contributing. The big problem everybody has is the horse is the one piece of that equation that we're not managing well. Right? If we have too many elk, the division issues more tags. The Division of Wildlife issues more tags. Have too many cattle, the BLM tells the rancher. In fact, this last year, a lot of ranchers only had 20% of their normal, 30% of their normal they lost 20 to 30% of their grazing capacity. But horses are just there all the time. They don't go anywhere. And so that's really where the problem comes to bear. Good question, though.
This is fascinating.